Siri fails the Turing test, Computation, Biosemiosis, and Artificial Life, with Victoria and Alexander of the Dactyl Foundation and New York Council for the Humanities. This presentation is based on a talk I gave at the 17th Annual Gathering in Biosemiotics at the University of Lausanne, Switzerland on June 8, 2017. First, let me add a quick definition for YouTube audiences. What is biosemiotics? Semiotics is the study of sign use. Most people think that using signs, as in words and pictograms, started with humans. Biosemioticians claim that sign use emerged before language, before animal consciousness, with the very first primitive life forms that were able to respond to gradients, differences in the environment such as light and dark, more or less glucose, or amino acids that form a pattern, and transform these gradients into other gradients and into other gradients, which eventually contributed to self-preservation. There's no conscious awareness of sign use, and yet it's purposeful in the sense of self-reinforcing. Okay, so inside the cell, such gradient transformation chain may proceed in a more or less arbitrary and inefficient manner before finally producing a useful end product. So, even for the most primitive life forms, gradients can function as signs of what is ultimately needed for self-continuation. We can say that these intermediary gradients stand for their ultimate function. We call this chain of transformations a semiotic habit that helps recreate the conditions that enable it to continue. And this is our definition of a sign. Alan Turing is considered by many to be the father of artificial intelligence. He was also an early pioneer of artificial life. He died tragically just as he was beginning this work. AI would have been very different now had he lived to continue. So what's the difference between artificial intelligence and artificial life? Basically, AI programs are designed using logic to perform set procedures. Artificial life programs do not have an intelligent designer. They're self-organizing. Okay, so what is computation? Before machine computers, human computers, there were people who worked as computers. They were human computers. They performed logical transformations by memorized set procedures. A procedure is a program or an algorithm or a machine, some people call it a machine, that performs an operation on something. Multiply x times y and get the result. Computer memories are basically lookup tables, not unlike this one. They have a kind of memory that is physically inscribed or programmed into their structure. The earliest computers were like switchboards, a movable lookup table. You used connections to route the transformation rules or to switch something on or off. This diagram shows the complicated chemical processes that go on inside a cell. It's called a cell signaling pathway, and it's a bit like a switchboard. There are connections that move energy and matter along, dividing one kind of molecule and adding another. We can say that a signaling pathway is also a machine, a program that transforms matter and energy according to set procedures. You could represent this pathway and what it does with an abstract code, sort of. Sometimes very different contexts make surprising things happen, and we'll get into that in a bit. Biological machines are unlike artificial machines, of course. Biological signs are often not based on uniform differences like ones and zeros, except when a chemical threshold is used to switch a process on or off. Organisms use chemical gradients, or the difference of formal properties, like the shapes of proteins, as signs. These kinds of differences are analog, not digital. Over evolutionary time, these biological programs have become the more or less permanent physical embodiment of the program. This is a model of a modern neural network computer, a deep learning algorithm. It is also a signal pathway. Today, computers can learn, that is, the connections between nodes can be altered depending on the kind of signals that are fed through them, strengthening or weakening connections and redirecting connections, affecting how nodes are switched on or off. And this is not too different from the first self-learning networks that Turing conceived in the 1940s. Changes to concrete biological programs might occur in evolutionary time, and this would be adaptation. Changes in behaviors of neural networks are ongoing, and this would be learning. Inside the cell, the neuron signal pathway, the program, has different kinds of parts that transform matter and energy. In neural networks, real or artificial, the program depends on more or less identical parts that change states depending on the different states of their neighbors. The transformation rules of computer code or reaction diffusion equations are entirely abstract, not physical, but these are all programs for transforming things. With artificial intelligence, changes to connections can be made by a programmer with set instructions, or a programmer can adjust the biases in the network so that with feedback, say from internet users, the network has the desired output, like identifying a face in a facial recognition algorithm. These self-learning neural networks are designed by a type of natural selection, or trial and error training. Rote learning is like programming oneself. Repeating the right procedure over and over until it becomes a habit actually changes your neural connections. Neurons that fire together wire together, like with artificial intelligence. This kind of learning is statistical. What happens the most gets selected. And you can repeat these habits without thinking. It's very machine-like. When he first started working on artificial intelligence, Turing assumed that training a human child depends largely on a system of rewards and punishments, trial and error. He wanted a computer that could make mistakes, so he designed a chess-playing program with optional set procedures that could be selected at random. If that move ultimately led to failure, it would not be reinforced. But do humans really always learn through reward and punishment? How do humans learn to encode set procedures? How do their neurons do computation? Is it always logical? Is it always the most statistically relevant information that is memorized? Well, before machine computers and before writing and before lookup tables, humans had other kinds of technologies for memory storage and information processing. They used narratives and poetic devices to help organize and store information in their minds. If an ancient astronomer studying the movement of the stars and planets did not have a practical way to write the patterns down, he might put this information into a narrative and use superhumans to symbolize the structure of the astrological calendar. This worked very well, and these stories are still with us today. A paragraph of a poem is called a stanza, which means room in Italian, from the Latin to stand in a location, to be situated. Poets used to memorize long narrative poems by associating the lines in each stanza with the various random objects in a room of a great palace. When they had to recall the poem later, they imagined themselves walking from room to room looking at the objects. People also used rhymes, pitch, rhythms, and imagery to store information. These first human technologies for memory storage are weird, right? They connect facts and details with chance associations. But it works. Why? What is the mechanism that is responsible for this? Why can you recall something better if you can link it to something else? Here, a similarity between Richard II and Christ metaphorically transforms him into a martyr. In semiotics, we call this kind of sign an icon. Also, here an object, a cross, associated with Christ, can stand in for him as metonymy. In semiotics, we call this kind of sign an index. These powerful associations can significantly guide interpretations of narratives. Daniel Tammet can calculate pi up to 22,500 decimal points. He has synesthesia, which helps him hold numbers in his mind. Each number for him has a unique color, texture, shape, and he sees numbers as landscapes while he's doing computation.
One, for example, would be very bright and shiny number. It's almost like somebody flashing a light in my face. It's a very interesting experience. Number 2 is kind of like a movement, right to left, kind of like a drifting motion. 5 is like the clap of thunder or the sound of a wave against a rock. 6 is very small. It's actually the number I find hardest to experience in any sort of meaningful visual way. So it's often the absence of anything. It's like a hole or a chasm or like a black hole. Number 9 is the biggest number. It's very tall. It can be intimidating.
Tema is not getting feedback or conditioning from the environment to help him learn. Doesn't seem like trial and error selection here. He uses an extreme form of the earliest methods of human information processing and storage. And this is not at all like artificial intelligence. So we have at least 2 very different techniques for computation. One is trial and error selection for function or statistical relevance. The other technique also builds connections, but it doesn't use the correct connections that are logically related to the environment or statistically relevant. So it doesn't follow the kind of logic that Turing initially thought would be important for imitating human learning. Biological computation seems to use formal properties, geometric properties, and temporal and spatial patterns, qualities that become significant, that is, help build functional patterns using relative similarity and proximity. Think of Terence Deacon's autocell example in Incomplete Nature, How Mind Emerged from Matter, or the L&T model that I've described in my book, The Biologist's Mistress, or in my video, The Science of Making Choices. Okay, lower level sign action. Let's pretend this is a neuron cell signaling pathway for transforming one state into another to make the neuron fire. I use Rube Goldberg-like machine here to illustrate how each step in the machine seems arbitrary, but we can say that each step represents the eventual outcome by functioning to bring it about. This pathway might have been designed in 100 different ways, so each step is somewhat arbitrary. It's a somewhat arbitrary sign. I argue that when a cell adapts or changes its program, it does so by using similar signs, not making random substitutions. For instance, the bird here could be replaced by a frog. Anything that might jump or fly when startled could work. In contrast, when artificial intelligence programmers want to imitate the human ability to learn and adapt, they might just allow one of the nodes to change at random. Maybe a brick or a rubber chicken or a candlestick could replace the bird. After a number of trials and errors, it might find a replacement part that works. This is what Alan Turing first thought before he began his artificial life research. Biosemiotics teaches us that organisms probably don't try out new signs at random very often. A new sign in this pathway must be similar and proximate, an icon or an index. Similarity is a relative difference, and therefore it is an analog difference, not a digital difference, as with AI. If sign action among neurons is also analog, using similarity and proximity of spatial and temporal patterns, information flow will be more robust and more flexible. It will be self-organizing, and it'll produce wave patterns. I argue that from the lower level sign action that uses analog difference of similarity and proximity, higher level patterns emerge. In his first artificial life paper, The Chemical Basis of Morphogenesis, which means, of course, the creation of form, Turing was exploring how an organism developed itself. He wanted to know more about how their connections, gates, and switches were designed. Turing identified the equations that describe chemical reaction process that initiates cell differentiation and development. These are 2D models of his equations. The thing to note is that this unorganized soup spontaneously forms patterns. The chemicals interact randomly at first, they're all mixed up. Then a chance pattern, based on a relative similarity and proximity, in some area gets reinforced and starts to grow. Again, we can think of the autocell or the L&T model. Turing discovered the type of reaction diffusion that produces zebra patterns. It produces a black pigment wave first, but when it runs out of a certain chemical, it suddenly becomes a white wave of pigment. But the white wave has a byproduct that eventually switches the black wave reaction back on again. It's a switch. It's a procedure that goes on and off. Turing thought that reaction diffusion that creates patterns was the mechanism that explained how an organism can start out as a collection of perfectly identical cells and then automagically differentiate, turn into heart cells, lung cells, etc. As chemicals diffuse across the identical cells, they leave behind traces of pattern in waves, chemical residue, that makes some cells different from other cells. These chemical differences, in turn, trigger the genes to make different kinds of proteins. So Turing discovered the genes do not contain a precise program for development. They don't have to. Turing had seen that development was not directly controlled by a program physically inscribed in the genes. The genes supplied the materials in the right order and in the right amounts, but the materials self-organize under the already existing physical constraints that could be described mathematically as programs. So, what about thought? Are there equations for organizing the actions of neurons? For decades, neuroscientists couldn't figure out how the brain puts sense data together into a coherent context, and this was called the binding problem. And how does AI deal with the binding problem? This is a deep learning algorithm for facial recognition. Individual nodes first identify contrast, then shapes, then put the shapes onto a map. AI is pretty good at identifying and classifying objects in this way, but it can go very wrong. Google's algorithm for classifying photos online labeled black people as gorillas. So why are human brains better at this? It used to be believed that brain waves were just sort of like the noise that an engine makes, and that it didn't serve any kind of function to help the engine run. Many neuroscientists now realize emergent brain waves synchronize distant neurons, creating virtual neuronal assemblies without creating permanent circuits. AI networks don't do anything like this. Brain waves acting as virtual circuits solves the binding problem. It explains how context is provided for thoughts. Emergent brainwaves provide organizing differences, not unlike the organizing wave patterns that Turing discovered in chemical reactions that guide morphogenesis. Emergent patterns are found throughout nature. This flock of starlings can fall into types: funnels, waves, folds. We compare these shapes to brainwaves. The wave, as it contracts and diffuses, constrains the behaviors of the individual starlings in the wave, further reinforcing the continuation of the wave pattern. So we may ask, what is the algorithm used by an individual bird, and how does the bird do computation? Let this diagram represent all the possible states that a single bird can be in, with several options for state changes. When a flocking pattern emerges, the individual bird starts cycling through its possible routes in a more efficient manner. J.P. Crutchfield calls this an Epsilon-Machine. It's the simplest representation of the possible states of a part of a complex system. Crutchfield found that initially when the parts start interacting, their behavior goes from strictly random to a mix of randomness and pattern. It is at this point that the emergent patterns appear. It's a sweet spot known as the edge of chaos. Once an efficient cycle is discovered by one individual in the flock, the cycle tends to pick up neighbors when, by chance, their cycles coincide. They all have similar constraints, so they're all capable of falling into similar cycles. You get a wave of birds more or less following each other, but this is not synchrony. It's diffusion. This is information flow, but they don't follow a precise algorithm. The individual birds here have to be flexible. They are all working with only partial information from their immediate neighbors about the flock as a whole. We don't need to think of the individual birds as logical or consciously acting with a goal in mind. Computer simulation of flocking can create artificial flocks. The programmers add some randomness to make them look more authentic. To my eye, this is still a bit fake. It's too symmetrical. I think this is because biological computation does not use merely random differences, which would smooth out state changes, so much as analog differences. And this would tend to make the shape of the flock still coherent, but less geometrical and more organic. These are shimmering bees. A metrochronal wave is similar to the one that is thought to act as a pacemaker in heart cells. Same type of wave at a football game. In this clip, there's a guy that pops up prematurely. The wave must flow around him and keep going. There's always a few that misfire, even in the heart. This wave has simple local behavior, either on or off. If you were to focus on just one guy, you would note that he jumps up and down at fairly regular intervals. Flocking is more complicated, of course. The birds have more options. If we could just focus on one bird in this flock and record its state changes, its motions in space, it would be very difficult to recognize any kind of pattern. Remember, the Epsilon-Machine is a mix of randomness and pattern, and the bird probably switches between different Epsilon-Machines, which create the different emergent patterns. If you're a neuroscientist and you are looking at just one neuron, it's going to be hard to tell that it's following any kind of algorithm. Like the chemical reaction in the Turing patterns, locally they appear to behave randomly as they produce the all-over patterns. Your smartphone doesn't do reaction diffusion. Its electronics don't make emergent patterns to provide contextual constraints for the neural nodes, gates, and switches. Emergent patterns, in turn, can be used as further signs to trigger other processes. And this is what is happening in the brain, where different regions can respond to the wave pattern of other regions. An emergent switch system that uses virtual dynamic connections would be fluid and flexible. In contrast, the kinds of decision switches used in most AI research are based on statistical summation of the local states. Complex emergent properties cannot be captured by statistics. This may be why AI tends to make decisions that remind us of bureaucrats, too rigid, unable to make judgments about complex situations. AI programs are being used today in U.S. court systems to pass sentences. They tend to give black people sentences that are twice as long as they give white people, with comparative data points. I want to make a connection here, too, to the court's decision in Alan Turing's case, based on a stereotype of gay men. Biosemiotics may be instrumental in helping AI research go in a better direction, or perhaps, even better, give up the idea of replacing human intelligence with artificial intelligence. AI, as it is very useful for searching and strict logical operations. Couple that skill with humans who have the ability to make judgments based on context, then you have the most efficient, effective system.